At 9:17 on the morning of December 7, 1941, Commander Minoru Genda stood on the flight deck of the carrier Akagi. 230 miles north of Oahu, he watched the second wave of Japanese aircraft vanish into the southern sky toward Pearl Harbor. Genda was the principal architect of the attack plan. For 11 months, he had refined every detail, calculating variables, preparing contingencies, studying the American fleet down to individual destroyers, memorizing aircraft inventories and defensive capability. He had studied aerial photos until he could draw Pearl Harbor from memory. Yet there was one number, one figure the entire Japanese naval intelligence apparatus had catastrophically misread. That single number determined the outcome of the war before a single shot was fired.
The Japanese High Command estimated that by December 1943, the U.S. Navy would have 13,070 officers and 296,000 enlisted men. The actual strength on that date was 219,279 officers, 120,472 officer candidates, and 2,343,343 enlisted personnel. They had miscalculated by a factor greater than 7 to 1. This was not a small intelligence slip. It was not a misplaced decimal. It was a fundamental failure to understand the enemy. And by the time Tokyo realized the truth, it was too late to change course.
The man who first noticed the discrepancy was Ensign Tadashi Yoshikawa. He wasn't a conventional intelligence officer. A promising naval aviator until a stomach ailment ended his flying career in 1936, Yoshikawa was reassigned to naval intelligence, where an analytical mind and a photographic memory made him invaluable. On March 27, 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor, Yoshikawa sailed to Honolulu under diplomatic cover as Tadashi Morimura. His mission? Observe American naval activity and report on fleet movements, base infrastructure, and defensive preparations. He was thorough. He took public tour boats through Pearl Harbor. He chartered small aircraft to photograph installations. He posed as a tourist, memorized patrol patterns, counted ships and aircraft, and cataloged their positions. His reports were detailed and accurate. The problem was not what Yoshikawa saw, it was what Tokyo assumed about what he saw.
Yoshikawa reported battleships, carriers, and cruisers. Tokyo counted those ships and calculated crews required to operate them, using Japanese manning standards as the baseline. Japanese warships operated lean. Fewer sailors, tightly drilled crews, minimal personnel. Tokyo assumed American practice matched their own. They were wrong. Japanese naval intelligence had access to information. Attachés in Washington, technical publications documenting American shipbuilding, captured documents, merchant seaman interviews. The raw data existed. But having data is not the same as understanding it. The system was institutionally weak. Intelligence was secondary to operations and command. The operations branches often ignored intelligence that contradicted existing plans. Intelligence billets were low prestige. Ambitious officers avoided them. Warnings that challenged operational assumptions carried little weight. Coupled with a cultural bias for offensive action and decisive battle, it became difficult for analysts to argue for restraint.
Captain Toshikazu Omebayashi served in the operations section of the Naval General Staff, responsible for long-range planning. He and his colleagues methodically used available intelligence to calculate how many ships the Americans could man, how many task forces they could field, and replacement rates. They examined shipbuilding schedules, training capacity, logistics, and supply infrastructure, and concluded the U.S. Navy could sustain roughly 40 major combatants in the Pacific with limited simultaneous operations. That assessment was folded into high-level strategy. The plan to seize resource areas in Southeast Asia, then establish a defensive perimeter, and force a negotiated settlement assumed American forces would be constrained by limited manpower. They were preparing for the wrong war.
The answer lies in mirror imaging, the analyst's tendency to assume the enemy thinks and organizes like you do. The Japanese projected their own naval model onto the United States. Japan emphasized elite, long-trained crews and did not rely on mass mobilization or reserves. Their peacetime navy of roughly 120,000 expanded to about 300,000 by war's end, a threefold increase that Japan called rapid. They could not imagine an American system that would recruit, train, and deploy on a completely different scale. In June 1941, the U.S. Navy numbered about 284,000 active-duty personnel worldwide. 18 months later, in December 1942, that figure had climbed to 1,640,000. By December 1943, it reached 2,374,094. The growth was exponential. Recruitment surged, training facilities multiplied, industrial and social systems oriented entirely toward war production. Japan studied American construction stats in trade journals. They understood shipbuilding speed. What they failed to understand was the U.S. ability to simultaneously recruit and man those ships. America was not constrained by manpower. A nation of 131 million people in 1941 had roughly 50 million men of military age even after agricultural and industrial exemptions and medical disqualifications. Japan's population was about 73 million, with more rigid social constraints. The mathematics were stark, but analysts saw the numbers through Japanese lenses, and those lenses blurred the truth.
The first sign appeared in May 1942 at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Japanese reconnaissance reported an American force centered on 2 carriers. Standard Japanese doctrine assumed 2,000 personnel per fleet carrier. 2 carriers meant roughly 4,000 men. But radio intercepts suggested multiple task group commanders, large logistics ships, and screening forces, a manpower figure nearer 7,000 to 9,000 for 2 carriers. Analysts noted it, then dismissed it as inefficiency. Then came Midway in June 1942. It was a tactical disaster for Japan. 4 fleet carriers sunk, over 3,000 personnel killed. What shocked Japanese intelligence was not loss of ships, but American damage control. Yorktown absorbed bombs and torpedoes, should have sunk, yet damage control teams restored power, patched flight deck holes with steel plates, and got her sailing again within hours. The Yorktown's crew list contained over 2,200 names, roughly 50% more than Japanese planners assumed. More personnel meant more damage control, maintenance, and sustained operations.
August 1942 at Guadalcanal showed the pattern again. Japanese intelligence expected limited American ground forces, perhaps 2 or 3 reinforced battalions, 8,000 to 10,000 men. The Marines landed 11,000 on Guadalcanal alone. Total American commitment in the Solomons exceeded 16,000. Naval support demanded more than 30,000 sailors. Merchant mariners crewed transports after rapid training. Japanese submarines observed convoys that made the Tokyo estimates impossible. Either the estimates were wrong, or America had found some way to multiply manpower. Tokyo chose to believe the Americans were overextended. By early 1943, field commanders sent alarming reports. Admiral Isoriko Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and served as an attaché in Washington, personally questioned intelligence estimates. If the U.S. had expanded beyond pre-war projections, Japan had to know. The Naval Intelligence Division re-examined 18 months of reporting: ship sightings, radio intercepts, prisoner interrogations, captured documents. Their preliminary totals exceeded 850,000, already double official estimates. Applying American manning standards pushed that number to 1,200,000, and that excluded training pipelines and shore establishments. Analysts concluded Japanese estimates were low by at least 3 to 1, possibly 4 to 1 or more. The reports were sent to Tokyo in spring 1943. They were read, debated, and, largely, discounted. The notion that America could train hundreds of thousands of sailors in months contradicted everything Japanese naval culture believed about building effective personnel. Captured prisoners' testimonies in 1943 described training centers processing 20,000 recruits per month at places like Great Lakes, Illinois. German reports confirmed heavier manning on American destroyer escorts than comparable Japanese ships. In September 1943, after exchanges with German naval intelligence, Tokyo quietly acknowledged there was a problem. A working group in the Naval Intelligence Division was formed to reassess with no regard for preconceived assumptions. 6 weeks of exhaustive work culminated in a report submitted on November 9, 1943. The new estimate placed American naval personnel near 1,800,000 by mid-1943, with projected growth to 2,400,000 by mid-1944. Even that was conservative. The numbers meant the defensive perimeter strategy, the hope that America would be unwilling or unable to sustain a long multi-theater war, no longer held. The U.S. could operate major concentrations simultaneously across oceans, sustain losses and still replace them, and hold extensive logistics networks. The math was immutable. Japan could not win a war of attrition against those resources.
The report was undeniable, but distributing it widely would trigger crisis, morale collapse among field commanders, demands for accountability, and political upheaval. So Tokyo classified it at the highest level, restricted distribution, and kept public planning unchanged. Field commanders continued fighting on outdated assumptions. The truth was known, recorded, and then buried, because acting on it would have meant admitting catastrophic institutional failure. By December 1943, actual American naval strength stood at 2,374,094. Tokyo's estimate had been 296,000. The miscalculation was roughly 7.8 to 1. This was not a failure of collection. The raw data was available. It was an analytical failure. Japan could not imagine an American mobilization model different from its own. Analysts filtered every data point through Japanese assumptions about navies, training, and mobilization. The result? Blindness. The consequences unfolded with brutal clarity. In 1944, the United States launched simultaneous major operations across multiple theaters: the Central Pacific offensives, the Southwest Pacific advances, and sustained Atlantic convoy operations. American task forces appeared to multiply. Sink one carrier group, and 2 more would arrive within weeks. Sink a dozen destroyers, and the fleet simply absorbed the loss. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the U.S. fielded a single task force of 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, roughly 70,000 personnel. At the war's outset, Japan had fewer than 400,000 personnel across all naval branches. America fielded individual formations representing significant fractions of Japan's entire maritime strength. The math favored the side with resources. The Americans could replace losses, Japan could not. Pilots, once lost, could not be recreated at scale. Ships sunk were gone forever. Superiority of spirit and tactics could not overcome an order of magnitude deficit in men and materiel. For those Japanese officers who understood the numbers, the bitter conclusion was simple: the war had been lost before it began. If Japanese planners had known in 1941 that American manpower could expand to millions by 1944, strategy would have differed. Perhaps Japan would have pursued limited objectives, defensive postures, or earlier negotiations. The expansive conquest strategy assumed an opponent with limited resources, an opponent who might negotiate. That assumption was false. The intelligence failure that created and sustained that illusion cost Japan everything it fought to preserve. The lesson is rarely about single battles or tactical blunders.
It is about the failure to see the enemy as they are. It is about mirror imaging your own institutions onto others. It is about organizational incentives that silence uncomfortable truths. In the next chapter, we follow the men who first saw the discrepancy, the officers who struggled to make Tokyo accept it, and the battles where the consequences of that blindness were writ large across the Pacific.
If you could ask one question to a sailor who actually served on the USS Enterprise during World War II, what would it be, and why? This kind of question sparks emotion, curiosity, and historical imagination, perfect for getting viewers to reply in the comments.